I think we can start, Kjetil, and then if anyone comes late, they can catch up on the recording.
Sure. All right. So I suppose perhaps we should all, since we're just four of us here, then perhaps it might be interesting for everyone to say who they are, since I haven't met all of you before, I think.
Let's do an introduction, and then we can start with you.
Sure. So my name is Kjetil Kjernsmo. I'm currently working in NORAD, so the Norwegian aid agency. But I have a very non-linear career. I have my master's is in theoretical astrophysics, and then I went to the IT industry, worked in companies like Opera, Computas, Startsiden, and then I went back to the University of Oslo to do a PhD in informatics. And since then, I've been mostly working on the solid projects. So, I suppose you might know about that because it is kind of in the proximity of the work that you've been doing.
Yep.
So first, now I worked for Inrupt. I was hired as the first employee of Inrupt, which is Tim Berners-Lee's company, to create an ecosystem around it. And then I did all kinds of things. Community management. I wrote parts of this No Solid server, which was old code and not very good. And now then I went to NORAD, where I'm working more on the governance of technology, and also within a project that's called the Digital Public Goods, which goes up to sort of the top of the United Nations. And that's mostly about free software for to achieve the development goals. But I'm still also on the governing board or the solid editors on behalf of NORAD rather than on behalf of Inrupt. Yeah, so that's me.
Perfect. I can go next. My name is Snorre Lothar von Gornedwin. I'm started my journey into this identity, a little bit more decentralized space. First with blockchains while working in Beck. I did get my graduation from NTNU, computer science, started straight into Beck, was always trying to push the bleeding edge for technology there through the learning groups. And once I found blockchain, I was sold, trying to get more engagement in Beck on blockchain, but that never happened. And then I ended up going to a hackathon with some people, and from there, Diwala evolved. And from there, the evolution or my learning curve into the identity space, as well as decentralized technology, has just dramatically increased. And from there, I also joined the Decentralized Identity Foundation as a chair for interoperability, and have started this DIN network with a couple of others to try to push forward the information about future identity technology in Norway. And that's also where I met Kjetil. And yeah, and that's my state right now. Just believe that doing technology a little bit better is healthier and better for everyone, and trying to revamp the way we have done digitalization as of now. We need to do better. So we can do Abelay next.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Abelay. I'm originally from Kazakhstan, but now in Norway, I am doing my PhD work at NTNU in Jorvik campus. During my master's, I was interested in blockchain and like decentralized technologies, And from there, in my PhD, I'm focusing on digital identity solutions with decentralized technology, specifically self-sovereign identity solutions, and also privacy-enhancing technologies. So yeah, I'm part of decentralized systems lab at NTNU, and in the middle of my PhD journey. Yep.
Thank you. Sani, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, hi. I am Sani Yusuf. So my journey into the identity space started in I guess last year, and I got a short-term contract where I was working with Affinity in SSI. I was the lead endeavor there, and I got to learn about this. So I've left that position, but I really like the SSI space. I like everything about it. And day to day, I'm actually a software engineer. I lead engineering where I mostly use Angular and Ionic. And yeah, I like things into DevRel, but I'm very interested into the SSI space because I think it's the only part of the Web3 community that has been widely accepted by governments and large corporations. So I think, yeah, I'm looking to learn more and more.
Perfect. We have you, Namvi, and a fellow Jitter. If you guys want to introduce yourself, speak up. If not, we can move onwards. Yeah, so let's go on. Chetil, he's on without a mic and a stationary machine and a baby on the seat. So we'll move onwards. We lost your screen, by the way. Is it possible to reshare?
Do you hear me?
We hear you. We
right.
don't see you, but we hear you. But we don't see your screen. So might need to.
So Chrome says that the page is unresponsive. So I think I need to reload. It seems.
No problem. Just go ahead. You're back. Yep. You're mute if you're trying to talk.
All right, good. So there is that we should be going now, I suppose.
It's all good now. We see you and hear you and all good.
All right, good. Okay, so yes, what I want to talk about today is more than the broader, is more than the technology landscape. I'm going to talk about what the things that I'm doing now, and which is a bigger thing than just the technology. But I'm going to start out with the technology, because so I suppose this is where we're coming from, every one of us. And first, I'd like to just set the stage for where we are together. So since I've been working on the Solid project, that is a different technology than for example, the ID and also verifiable credentials, where I know that many of you are working in that space. And I think it's safe to say that we acknowledge the same problems, and that we're working in the same problem space. We acknowledge all the problems around the data hoarding that big tech is doing, we see identity as very important for how data is managed and shared, and how it also is instrumental for our personal control of our data, and how that is also going to be very important for society as a whole. What I also note is that some of the technologies, for example, verifiable credentials, that is being developed by the credentials community group and their working groups, are reused basically as they are in Solid. And that is particularly the verifiable credentials. In some implementations, they have gone further and also used the HTTP protocol for verifiable credentials. We're looking into whether that is appropriate, or whether we should be using more of the Solid protocol for that kind of thing. But it's very clear that we have a very considerable overlap between the technologies that are being done in the verifiable credential space and in Solid. So there is no competition here. There is a lot of we're looking in that direction all the time and getting engaged, and we don't have any desire to reinvent wheels that are done elsewhere. But we also have obviously technologies, for example, very much in the built on top of HTTP, that are well suited. And also, the idea in Solid is to keep the server relatively simple and put more of the logic on the client side. And so, if there is a conflict there, then we might be like going for more general solutions on the server side, and not so much like adapting every API. Snorre, yeah.
So, do you feel that we ever will come to a space where we'll be more in the blockchain world, where a lot of the actual things that's happening in like your mobile or browser, and then the transactions just pass to the front end, which executes further in? Like, what that allows the world to do is to share much more of the data. And if we can, how do you look upon that, like the way that the blockchain world works today, and how they're able to just so simply spawn up new web pages which shares everything they need to do?
Right. So I don't know that much about the blockchain world in general, actually. So because Solid is very much a web technology, right? It's intended to be a small. It's intended to be a relatively small addition to the web, which I will also get to later. And I think there is a bit of tension between sort of the blockchain world and the Solid world, especially over proof of work. But I don't think we are. I think we're sort of relatively aligned where it comes to like using crypto for sort of the basic identity, that kind of stuff, but not so much aligned when it comes to like putting stuff on a blockchain. Then we're more classical web technology. But that being said, I think that like did having did on as an identity, using that as an identity in place of an HTTP URL, for example. That is very feasible. That is something that's been on our sort of board for a very long time. So it's more that we're interfacing some components there. I would suspect.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Yeah. So I think it's safe to say that some interoperability between these worlds are quite likely. Also, I think that since we're sort of working in the same problem space, I think that we're probably seeing a lot of the same problems with the technology landscape as it is today. Like all the problems that are happening around big tech. And that might seem rather unsurmountable, but I think there is a very strong case for optimism. So I'd like to start out with being very optimistic. So I think there are a few key drivers there. One is that you have an exponential data growth, which means that in some interval into the future, you will have twice as much data as there is today, and that's probably not so far out either. And there is also you often also see an exponential uptake of technology, which means that there basically is much more power in tomorrow's data than today's, right? So if we can only, even though there is a lot now, there is even more tomorrow. And if we find ways to have a more reasonable or a better management of those data, then we're probably going to be in a quite good position. Also importantly, I think that it's important to remember that, like people are saying, that if you're not a customer, you're the product. And it's okay to say that, but it's not really true, because the product is more or less this persuasion architecture. Like it's designed to sell you stuff. We don't really need that. It doesn't really have a very important function in society. And so the stuff that we actually need to replace of the current technology is much less than what big tech has been investing in for a decade or 15 years or something. And that is also a good reason why why we should be optimistic. We don't need to replace all that stuff. We only need to replace the stuff that is useful and beneficial, not all the exploitative stuff, where most of the investments have been going into. So I think we need to be optimistic. Anyway, so Solid now is as I said, is a thin layer on the web, and it adds like identity and authentication for starters, which is currently based on YDC. But there is a number of us who don't really like all the ping pong that is in those kinds of protocols. So it's very much designed to be open to others. In principle, for example, the more open ecosystem of the IDs, and we're also, there are people looking into, for example, HTTP signatures, which could also form the basis of that kind of stuff. But we're looking at identity probably in a more narrow term than you might be doing. I suspect that is the case, because we're not putting attributes on your identity, like your age, for example, which is apparently more of an integral part of the stuff that you're doing, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, so in the perspective is that, like, you always have identification, authentication, and authorization. So
Yep.
Authentication is easy, and then it's identifying who that person is. That should come from verifiable credentials, and it's an exchange of data at that point to be able to identify. And then it depends on the receiver who's going to say, okay, what are my criteria for identification? What data do I need to see, or what issues do I need to see to be able to identify? And then authorization is per now is more internal offer, but we do have a interesting research project that we hopefully will reapply again, where we look upon the thing called fullmakt, like how can someone give you the scope of authorization when you go and authenticate, then identify, and then how do you provide a given authorization to an external service that doesn't necessarily know what you have done or what you're supposed to be able to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so the authorization frameworks that we have are very basic, or that is, we have the web accessibility, access control, which is like a very old, relatively simple, pretty straightforward framework developed at MIT a very long time ago. So it's been implemented, and it has historical backing. And then there's the access control policies, which much more comes from a securities viewpoint, but it was designed without much public input. And so we're looking towards it possibly converging now. It doesn't seem like theoretically it's very different from WAC, even though it looks very different. And so there is some competition there that I think that we will need to settle quite soon. So yeah, but so that part is more of the soon soon thing. I think it's important that Solid is also building a knowledge graph. So you can build really large scale knowledge graphs using Solid. And I personally feel that large-scale knowledge graphs are needed to really scale out on large scale. So that is a very important thing, I think, in Solid. Even though the basic data organization on a pod is hierarchical, and that seems like a big paradox given the web. So the web is sort of the first large-scale realization that hierarchical structures usually don't work that well. And so it seems odd to be putting a hierarchical data organization on top of that. But the idea is that you need to have even a different knowledge organization layer on the top of that again. Which is also something that you need to really scale out. Because we obviously anticipate a very great growth of data. So and the knowledge organization systems you have, for example, the simple knowledge organization system is still quite advanced, right? So you can trivially put that up on the top of Solid. And there is also a notification layer. The initial the MIT implementation that was there a long time ago didn't have a really good security design, so we're redesigning that right now. But it is there. It's an important part of Solid. So in terms of what is going to be Solid very soon, then we have verifiable credentials, which has been implemented, and it very much it references the work that is being done by the credentials interest group, community group. So it's basically that. What is contentious there is basically whether it should use the HTTP protocol that has been designed there, or something more Solid specific. There are also various proposals around consent. Different groups are working on different things. and that is also converging on something that we will be having in Solid soon. Obviously, querying data on a relatively large scale is something that is also very important to Solid. And it has been, like, my PhD is about that. So it's an important part of it, but we haven't like prioritized doing that on to any great extent before now. Data validation is also going to be an important part of Solid. So yeah, so that's basically what I intended to say specifically about Solid. I hope you have sort of an overview of what it is, because the things that I like to be talking about is talking about next is to the extent that so for a long time I believed that just having personal data control would be setting off a social technological revolution in which you would have people much more, or you would have people empowered so that you would regain regulability and regain the status of the individual in society from the current situation. And I don't believe that anymore. I think we have so many problems that have to be dealt with in a much more cross-disciplinary fashion. So and that is, for example, an idea that has been going around, that you have this data vault, this data vault ID, but I think that is also not really what we would want, because what has happened in society is that we've been basically given two extremes. Either you are completely promiscuous about your data, so I call it data promiscuity, or you have a data vault, like you lock down your data. That's my data. That's something that I lock down as much as possible. And the GDPR is basically maintaining that division. Either you are within something that is like you're within a moral organization that takes care of your data, or you're maintaining it yourself. You're like really locking it down, or if that is not possible, then you have to be completely promiscuous about it. You have to give it to all the big players, and also if even in in state-sponsored situations, like the first Smittestopp app, that was basically you were given these two possibilities. Either you're completely promiscuous by giving your data to a terrible hack, or you don't. And in the other case, you're sort of an enemy of the people because you don't want to you're not participating in coronavirus, the battle against the coronavirus. And giving people that kind of choice is terrible. So I think that we have to shift the debate somewhat, and to understand there is a lot of continuum there. And I mean, a data vault is really really easy. You just have to submit. You just have to encrypt stuff symmetrically, and just then you can stuff it anywhere, basically. So I think that everything interesting lies between those two extremes. So you can go from your hospital bed, where yes, you probably should make things private, but you should be sharing things with your doctor, to your bedroom where there is at least two players, to your living room where you have your family, to a football field where you have a club, to a town square. Like, so there is this continuum around in how your data should be managed. So, and even so, I'm seeing a lot of pressure in Solid to be designing for these data vaults. Like, confidentiality becomes so important that that you might be compromising your ability to do any of the more interesting things around this continuum. And some even see that as desirable. And that's now attention in many of the detailed choices that we make. And that is the kind of debate that shouldn't be confined in like forums like this. Like it shouldn't be something discussed among technologists. It should be something that is discussed in more in open democratic forums. So how would democracies make these calls? So I'm thinking in terms of the norms that societies have. So norms can emerge in many different ways. You can have them in terms of laws, and that's sort of how I think most people think about them in Norway, and I suppose much of the Western world, is that norms are something that are regulated in law, or in that kind of regulations. So it's set by it's set in democracies, in the parliament, and that kind of stuff. But in many places, in many places in the world, religion might be at least as important as laws to give norms. Culture might be also a way to set norms. For example, you don't jump in a queue. That's more of a cultural norm than that. There are no regulations that say that. And funnily enough, for example, there is no limit for a lower salary in Norway. It's regulated in common agreements or stuff like that. But it's also a norm that you can't pay somebody who's working for you nothing. Like so even at that level, you see that. And I think what happened? I think also importantly that technology does that. So technology does set norms. And you can, for example, say that if you have an anonymous user, or a pseudonym identity, or a real identity, that influences behavior. And that is a technological, that's a norm then set by how the technology works. Again, this balancing of security needs may set norms. Or an algorithm that optimizes for engagements sets norms for public debate and has become a major problem. So, and in the extreme case, you could have autonomous weapon systems that decide life and death. And I think that it's safe to say that technology today creates de facto norms. So it's really there. But de facto norms isn't what we need. We need democracies to create technologies that guide norms. And then we can ask what basic properties they need to have. And that's what I'm trying to introduce now, is the concept of normative technologies. And since I've just said that, yes, you can sort of some technologies do set norms now. We could say that, well, you can't then define this. But I'd like to just try to fill in what I would mean by this. So normative technologies are technologies that have the potential to set societal norms. They have to be non-exclusive, so that everyone must have access to them as a right. They must be open in the sense that everyone is entitled to understand them and to participate in their construction. And development must be guided by legitimate governing bodies. So what does that necessarily entail? Is that, well, if you have a stake as a developer, then yes, that might be a legitimate reason why you should be represented there. But I think that it's also important that these legitimate governing bodies, that you derive legitimacy from, for example, a democracy. Still, we have to acknowledge, I think it's very, very important to acknowledge that concrete implementations are very powerful, and therefore it's very, very important to have a very tight feedback loop between implementers and other decision makers. Because there is a lot of power in actually writing the implementation, and that is okay. I think it's also ultimately it's that citizens should have the right to reject technologies by not using them. I think it's very problematic if we're forcing technology on people. I think that we need to for this we need to have permanent societal institutions. It doesn't, like, I'm seeing quite a lot of projects. I'm seeing also quite a lot of things that are funded by philanthropy in this space, but they don't necessarily derive their legitimacy from a democracy. And I think that to really be able to respond, then to societal changes, we have to have permanent societal institutions. And therefore, I'm proposing that society should be putting up a center for normative technology development. And so basically, the backstory there is that my position at NORAD is temporary, and this is where I'm going. Right. So this is what I'm trying to achieve within that, and I have the backing, because we see that this is very, very important for a lot of situations in developing countries. So building this center for normative technology development, and I'll talk a bit more about what that would be, I think is very important. I think we also need another societal institution, which is an oversight body, which provides an oversight of the other technology players, which most of them are going to be private, of course, but also to try to find out why certain projects might break. Like, why aren't people taking up these normative technologies, adjusting the course, making a power balance towards the development institute, for example. So the Center for Normative Technology Development, that is to develop technologies with a democratic mandate rather than a commercial one. And I think it's not just that it needs to have that democratic mandate. It's also because I propose that normative technologies has this property of non-exclusivity, which means that it's difficult to build a business model around it. Because, like, most economics tend to rely on non-exclusivity and non-rivalry. And also, like, that is also partly what you're trying to do with a blockchain, right? So you're trying to establish something that is exclusive, or part of it is about establishing a digital good that has the properties of exclusivity and rivalry. But in this case, that's not what you want. You want to have something that is non-exclusive, so that everybody can participate in this part, and it's probably just as well, it should be probably a non-rivalrous also, but that's a different topic. I think it's very important that that this center is very cross-disciplinary, because to understand the full extent of these norms, I should be able to walk down the corridor and talk to a folklorist or a social scientist and so on, so that I can have a different view on things. And I like them to sit also with the programmers, because it has many of the choices that we make, the detailed choices, really have a very profound impact that has to be understood in non-technical terms. But it's important that it's set up. Yes, Nora?
I wonder, like, how do you kind of sell this into to Norad in terms of you have open source, you have the terms of cross-disciplinary teams in commercial places, but like, how can you make this? How do you believe this can become a reality without money from the government that supports it? Or is that the point, that there has to be something coming from a government that wants a bigger...
Yes, it has to come from the government. So that is the point that I'm making. So in terms of what NORAD is seeing, it's a lot around the information pollution arena, like disinformation, misinformation, and so on. Because like 20% of humanity lives in very fragile areas. Like, things can explode into genocide very quickly. And the realization there is that we have very, very limited power. We basically have no power to influence how the technology is developed and deployed, and therefore we can't do anything about the problems that we are seeing. And having sort of trying to regain that power in these very fragile areas is absolutely instrumental. So they're kind of already sold on the idea, but they also recognize, and I'm also talking with partners, especially in India, but also around the EU, which is also starting now to warm up to this idea that we need to go there. But it's been rather disorganized. It's been more or less project based, like the Decode project in Barcelona and Amsterdam, which is very interesting stuff, but it's still not like it doesn't live for very long after the project ended.
Do you think that you'll get like UN for normative technology in the future?
Yeah, so I don't know that we will get for normative development, because I'm thinking, let's see, I'm going to do take a couple of I think the legitimacy is better derived from the nation state, but you need to have a very international focus. Like, why do you say that I want to have this rather than that? Well, because my government, based on the democratic mandate, says that this is the right direction that we're going. So that is how you derive the legitimacy. I'm rather thinking in terms of the oversight body. So what would the oversight body look like? I'm thinking about, like, in a model from that you have national oversight bodies as well, but you might also have like an international law type of body that might be deriving their legitimacy from the United Nations. So, but yes, it's interesting to see where this is headed. I really don't know. But yeah,
There's a very interesting direction to, like, You can basically call the open source community a test bed for this, and then you need to put some more hitting power behind it. So it's a very interesting direction and how that this can be going, because what you see, for example, in diff, which is a standardization body, and they host a lot of technology, but they depend on commercial actors to be sponsored and giving the money and getting the benefit to have this technology to work, to be able to want to sponsor the code back into diff. So there's some directions there that potentially this can help a lot with.
Yeah, and then there's the problem of, right, okay, so I've been part of the open source community for a very long time, but I'm also seeing that we are relatively narrow-minded in terms of who gets to say, and that is, I've been starting to see that as a problem, and I mean, we were really the only ones who have sufficient transparency to provide knowledge for democracies to work. Like, most of the industry has for 30 years deprived democracies of knowledge on how technologies work. The open source community is really the only exception to that. And so when people say that, well, democracies aren't able to develop technologies with sufficient speed, but well, that's why. But that's the reason why, is that we've been depriving democracies of knowledge for 30 years. Obviously, that's not going to work. So I think we need to be much more sharing the knowledge, and I know open source community has done that, but it's also not put sufficient thought into governance when it comes to who outside can influence the direction that we're going. But on the other hand, it's if you're a volunteer, then obviously you act in your own self-interest. If you're paid by a company, then you act in their interest, and it's mostly those two groups that have been coming together. And now it has to be a third group, right? It has to be these normative institutions that are coming in and having not all the representatives in a governing body, but at least one or two, right? And that would probably make a difference.
I see EU is trying to take this role in certain situations, but they're doing it very black boxy.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to contribute and even participate in the development they're trying to push forward.
Yeah. And that has to, we have to make sure that doesn't happen either, right? It's and we have to make sure that these initiatives aren't just dying out after the project ended, like many have done. So and we have to also make sure that we're developing. So it's very important, I think, that these institutions will have to be set up for practical development. They can't be research institutions. No. Because research institutions, even though there are many good examples of how contributions from research institutions, they are generally not set up to do that, to develop on that scale, and to have the longevity of the code that is required, and all the project management and that kind of stuff. So it has to be set up differently than, for example, a university. So I also tried to introduce another concept, which I call the societal scale technologies, because, like, thinking in terms of, like, we're talking about web scale technologies, so things that are scalable across for web use, basically, but is going to be very big if you're going to think about the technologies that are foundational across society. And I think identity is so and
Live streaming is on.
good. Okay, so and I think, for example, shared data management, how you share data, how you maintain your data, your authorization to it, and how you manage data streams, all that kind of stuff is also like foundational. Or knowledge organization is one other thing, and a lot more. And I think that is another perspective, is that we can't just design, like, for example, you have a lot of investment in governmental tech, like how do you make the public sector more efficient? And that is that's just a small part of society, right? It's like I tend to tell these people I know from working on Altin is that I don't care that much about the back end of Altin, but if my kids aren't going to birthdays, then that's a disaster, right? You have to think about the whole society if you're going to enable people to actually have meaningful participation in technology. And I think that thinking about this in the societal scale is very, very important. So I'd like to end with another slide, and that is this by Tim, where he shows this virtuous circle, and that is, I think, designing for this is very important. Like if I write a blog, people link to my blog, and then you get into a virtuous circle. Things are getting better because things are connected that way. You could imagine something to combat, for example, information pollution, is that if you can make sure that information becomes more valuable by being accurate, then you have incentives that make information more accurate. And then you can have social groups that make each other more secure by flagging problematic information and so on. And then you get into this virtual circle around information quality. And that is one key aspect that I think a normative technology development institute will have to be very, very clear about, that this is the kind of drivers that you could have. So I don't know where this ends, but I think that it starts by starting this kind of normative technology development institute. And I don't know where to really go exactly from there either. but I think it's very, very important that we do start that. So that is the end of my presentation.
Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting, and makes you think. But I'm glad that you're doing this in a supportive environment where for NORAD, and it means that it's very capable to be able to be happening.
Yeah.
Which is good. Are there any other questions? I have some, but we can listen to any other people speak. You can write them, and I can tell you if you guys have anything in the chats. I always love Norwegian presentations.
All right. Okay, so in the chat there. Oh, right. Okay, so yeah. It was too long there. Okay.
Yeah, I was just that was a little bit too long, so I just put it in. Yeah, we had two people joining in midway. It was Lasse and Marius. Marius had to leave, but he's been here. Like, at what level do you feel that the development currently is? Like, when do you think we'll see the first NPM package coming from Center of Normative Technologies?
So I really don't know that. It's so we're currently working in several forums, mainly around this public digital goods. There is stuff happening sort of on the ministerial level, and I've been able to mention this idea of having normative technologies into those forums.
Yeah.
And there are people in high places now that are talking in those directions. But I don't know. So part of my problem is that I have quite a lot of network outside of Norway, but not so much within. So it's I need to sort of reach into politics in Norway, I think, for this to happen in Norway.
Yeah.
So most of my contacts are out of Norway.
You're at this place in the right place, though, to be able to.
Yeah. So I would very much like to hear if anybody also has some contacts that could potentially make this something that we could do, or some people that I could talk to. It's all about networking, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we're, at least for me, I'm looking for the same, but I'm also like just seeing how Germany was able to get that SSI thinking going is just very incredible. Like, how did they get that funding from a governmental level? Because they have they're missing a lot more than we are here in Norway, but they got something going on because they was pushing that communication enough. They were sharing the willingness and the want to have this better way of spreading data and sharing data.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And you have the sovereign. What was that called again? In Germany, you have the what was it? Sovereign Tech Fund. I can paste you that link. Is that the one that funded?
I'm not sure who did fund, but I know that there have been probably coming from multiple directions to be able to get that much money.
Yeah.
It looks that's interesting.
And you know, they study. It's sort of interesting to see. For Germany also funded GNUPEG for many years.
Yeah.
And that was started in the 90s. And then you have the National Science Foundation in the US had also programs at least back in 1992.
Yeah.
So we've had the kind of money, and there's all these EU projects that also produce, like, you produce something over 3 years, and then you hope it sticks. And I have seen very, very few examples of it sticking. So I that's why I think that we need absolutely to have permanent institutions. And then if many nations start to do this. So I should mention, by the way, that Taiwan has done it.
Wow.
You have Ode Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan. She's done it. So she has like 30 people there. So that's probably the first place that this has happened. There was an article in the Wired magazine about her. Um,
That's very interesting, though.
yeah, and also India is thinking in like this direction. So they started from their GovTech. Um, they started from GovTech basically, and then they realized that, well, to actually have any power in these ecosystems, we have to think like on a societal level.
Mm.
And then we started talking basically with Norad, and then so things started rolling there because they're also a member of this deep digital public goods alliance.
Yeah.
So so there are stuff happening, but I haven't yet been able to reach into the political level. But and sooner or later I will have to get there.
Yeah, I'll try to share that reach out on the next newsletter and see if there's anyone catching up. I know that Chipset and Stadia are very actively participating in discussions on a political level. I have some names there I can try to send over to
Right.
you afterwards. And you can see if that because they talk about the both very specific perspective and a general perspective, and they might be able to talk a little bit more about this as well.
Good.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. And if there's no other questions, I think we have gotten a really nice introduction to this, and it's made my mind think a bit, at least. So
Good.
it's going to be interesting to follow along.
Great. All right.
Perfect.
So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for coming and sharing, and thank you guys for meeting up. And then I hope we had a good introductions to how we can make technology development better.
All right.
Perfect.
Cheers.
Thank you. See you.
Yeah, thank you, Ed.